My name is Peggy Clark. I'm Vice President of the Aspen Institute and Executive Director of Aspen Global Innovators Group. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our 6th annual Madeleine K. Albright Global Development Lecture. Today, we're especially pleased to honor Her Excellency Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Nobel Laureate and former President of the Republic of Liberia and Africa's first democratically elected female head of state. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
As many of you know, the Aspen Institute prides itself on amplifying the leadership of those on the front lines of vulnerable communities. These heroes help the rest of us realize that we all can do so much more than we even think we're capable of. These two women are a perfect example of that. That's why every year we recognize an exceptional individual who's provided breakthrough thinking in tackling the challenges of global development. There's perhaps no better moment to recognize President Sirleaf, the first female president of Africa, as we awoke to the news this morning of the victory of more than 100 women who were elected to Congress. And the dawn of what many believe is the women's wave in terms of U.S. leadership. To say that Ellen Johnson Sirleaf tackled development in a remarkable and breakthrough way is a major understatement. After 2 decades of civil war in Liberia, she had to, with no exaggeration, build democracy from scratch. And no one has a wiser perspective of the complexities involved in creating breakthroughs after breakdowns in any society than our former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. This wonderful lecture series is named in Madeleine's honor precisely because she has and continues to lead us with the light of her democratic ideals when many of us can't find our way in the dark. Secretary Albright has continually shown us the lasting power of democratic values and the power of courage. You're a beacon for us all, Secretary Albright. Thank you so much. And I'd like to close with words from someone from the Bronx, just north of us here tonight, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, newly elected Congresswoman from the Bronx and youngest female ever to serve in Congress. And what she said just last night was, our greatest scarcity is not a lack of resources, but the absence of political courage and moral imagination. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome the very enlightened Madeleine Albright.
Okay. Peggy, thank you very, very much for your kind words and for the incredible leadership that you have shown on everything to do with Aspen and this particular program. I'm very pleased to be here and to see so many good friends here in the audience. And I want to especially welcome Dan Porterfield, who became president of the Aspen Institute in June. Really great to have you here with us. Thank you. Dan, I couldn't be happier to have you leading the charge at an organization that is so dear to my heart and so important to my brain. As Peggy mentioned, the lecture series is now in its 6th year, and while I may be biased, I do believe it has become one of the most compelling platforms anywhere for the discussion of global health and development trends. This year, we are breaking new ground by holding this event in New York for the first time. Now, I wish I could claim this was always the plan, but the truth is that President Johnson Sirleaf was asked by the National Democratic Institute to lead a very important election observation mission in Zimbabwe during the same days I had invited her to come to Aspen, Colorado. The problem is that this is a genuine conflict between the right side and left side of my brain and the things that I do all the times because I'm chair of the National Democratic Institute, which kind of put me in an awkward position. But I'm delighted that we all got together and found an elegant solution, one which allowed President Johnson Sirleaf to perform a valuable service to democracy and enabled us to welcome her this afternoon here in New York. This setting may be a little bit different from a summer evening in Aspen, but this discussion promises to be as enlightening and inspirational as we always are able to have. And this is because our honoree this afternoon is one of history's truly pioneering leaders, a visionary who broke profound barriers to become the first woman to be elected president of an African nation. When Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was only a few days old, an elderly man came to visit her parents in Liberia and proclaimed, "This child shall be great. This child is going to lead." Now, for years, she and her family would laugh at that story, because as she later put it, for a long time her life seemed to be anything but great. She was the young mother of 4 who struggled to pursue an education and build a career in government. She was the finance minister who was forced into exile by a military coup. And she was the Senate candidate who returned from exile only to be arrested, imprisoned, and exiled again for criticizing Liberia's military government. It has been said that Liberia is a country of almost impossible social, religious, and political complexity. As well as we all remember, the country was ravaged by a horrific civil war in the 1990s, and more than any other group, women were its victims. Their sons were conscripted and forced to fight, their daughters were raped, and their lives were threatened on a nearly daily basis. So it's no surprise that Liberia's women would rise up and demand change. And it's no surprise that Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the one they found, really is their Iron Lady. That nickname referred not only to her having survived imprisonment, but to the incredible energy she brought to the campaign trail during her run for president. As she campaigned, she vowed to visit all of Liberia's 15 counties, which forced her to drive all night on roads that were unpaved and full of potholes. Sometimes there weren't even roads, so she did what any woman with her kind of courage would do. She took a canoe and paddled herself across rivers to visit villages. And when that didn't work, she walked or swam. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf made history when she was elected president in 2005, but that was hardly the end of her remarkable story. As president of a country that was still emerging from war, she inherited a devastated economy and shattered political institutions. The odds against her success were high, but once again, she defied them. Under her leadership, Liberia's debilitating foreign debt was canceled and foreign investment came back. And it overcame the horrific Ebola crisis, thanks to, in large measures, to the international assistance which she was able to seek out. But most important of all was the work that Ellen Johnson Sirleaf did to promote peace, reconciliation, and democratic development. And it was this heroic work that earned her the Nobel Peace Prize and the coveted Mo Ibrahim Award. And it is for these historic contributions that she will be most remembered. President Johnson Sirleaf has so much to teach us about democracy, development, and the future of Africa. And I'm just thrilled that she has agreed to join us today to share her vision for the future of the continent. So I now would like to invite her to come here, but before she gives her speech, it's my honor to present her with a, I think, so I'm known kind of for my pins, so a shield pin symbolizing her commitment to defending democratic values on behalf of all of her fellow citizens and men and women everywhere.
Thank you, Peggy. Thank you, Madeleine, for the introduction. Colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to give this year's Madeleine K. Albright Global Development Lecture, recognizing those who came before me on this platform that was established in the year 2012. Those include Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Paul Farmer, Helen Clark, Mary Robinson, and Raji Shah. Madam Secretary, I am deeply honored to be here with you. I have the deepest admiration and respect for the contribution you have made to America and to the world. But I'm afraid, my dear friend, neither one of us knows the definition of retirement. We are both still at it and will continue to be at it until a bigger calling tells us not to. I will talk today about our beloved Africa, a continent of wide diversities, culture, history, religion, endowment. I will speak specifically on how to continue the path from incremental to transformative change. I make these remarks as an imperfect leader coming from a complex post-conflict society on a continent of uneven progress in a world that seems at a fast pace of change, sometimes appearing unrecognizable. I further preface my remarks by sharing with you that I feel a renewed sense of urgency in my 80th year, not because I'm closing in on the last chapter of my life, but because by the year 2030, the year when the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals will be assessed, 65% of the world population will be youth, and they will be Africans. The transformative path of Africa must thus continue to do things differently or risk a demographic shift that will overwhelm Africa's productive resources, setting off a new chain of migration that will further inflame the emergence of right-wing xenophobic political forces in our world. The message is clear. We cannot and should not fail another generation of African young people. We must build institutions that are stronger than the whims of an individual. We must break down the barriers to political entry for women, youth, and other political outsiders. We must equip Africa's children with the education and skills necessary to succeed in the 21st century. Dear friends, Africa has done it before, and I believe that we are capable of meeting this challenge. I draw these conclusions from my own experience as Liberia's first post-conflict elected president, with a clear understanding of the inherent fragility that result from changes that disrupt the status quo. My administration came into power in 2006 after 2 decades of conflict. Liberia suffered under a collapsed economy, decaying infrastructure, and paralyzed state institutions. My administration inherited a crushing debt burden and some 100,000 ex-combatants and youths swelled unemployment to more than 80%. We found a bloated civil service and a society defaulted in desperation, violence, and economic dependency. We understood that our newly consolidated peace would be strongly linked to inclusive growth and development, both of which create equitable opportunities for all citizens. My administration went to work re-establishing Liberians within the community of nations, restoring relationships with the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and our bilateral partners to receive the necessary technical and financial support for achieving macroeconomic stability, which would lead us down the path to microeconomic progress. We had to determine immediate impactful interventions. We first sought to negotiate relief from the $4.7 billion of external debt burden. We then re-established the fiscal discipline and enacted regulations which would encourage inward and foreign direct investment. As a result, our economy went from ground zero to achieving a growth rate of over 9% at its peak, among the highest on the African continent at the time. Following economic reform, we sought to enhance good governance, to develop our all but decimated democratic institutions, starting with the security sector, to restore the rule of law, and to build confidence in the new and yet still fragile peace. We established and strengthened integrity institutions to fight a deeply entrenched culture of dishonesty. We sought partnerships with philanthropic institutions to strengthen our civil service through repatriation and local mentoring training. We invested in social services, beginning with fixing our roads, paving hundreds of kilometers, which unlocked the potential of people and goods to move freely around the economy. Monrovia, our capital city, for the first time in decades, had running water and electricity. School enrollment in Liberia reached nearly $2 million. We achieved near gender parity in elementary schools and have placed a renewed focus in retaining girls' enrollment in school. As I pivot from Liberia to the future of Africa, I do so with great humility. Let me go back 1 minute. After all of these, then in 2015, the Ebola epidemic hit. creating shocks, which draws economic growth close to 0%. There was an exodus of investors from the country, creating a 2-year halt in productive activity. The epidemic ended in April 2016, but today the country and the subregion are still recovering. Notwithstanding, even after losing nearly 3,700 of our remembered citizens, we emerged from the deadly Ebola outbreak as a stronger nation, better prepared to address the next pandemic in partnership with an awakened international community. And finally, in January of this year, I handed over presidential power in a peaceful and democratic transition, the first of that order in Liberia for 75 years. A moment which still resonates with me as one of our proudest. The Liberia that President George Weah inherited boasts a diverse and active civil society and a vibrant free press. These free-willed voices of society and a free press will hold his government and any successive government accountable as they did me and my administration. As I move on to talk about those things that Africa must do, I do so with great humility, recognizing that even after 2 terms, my administration did not accomplish all the things we set out to do. But we did lay a strong foundation of which we are proud. Despite the tremendous progress throughout the continent, we must be, as Africans, impatient with ourselves and our leaders. Last month, the Mo Ibrahim Index released its 11th report, reflecting a discouraging deterioration in governance. Most alarmingly, the 2018 Index report reports that since 2008, the African average score for sustainable economic opportunity has increased by 0.1 point, or 0.2%, despite a continental increase in GDP of nearly 40% over the same period. In effect, this means that there has been virtually no progress in creating sustainable economic opportunity. Economic growth has not translated into better living conditions for the majority of Africans. Upon releasing the index, Mo said, "Our continent is faced with unprecedented demographic growth. Key governance areas are not progressing fast enough to keep up with the rising demand, and more specifically, to answer the growing expectation of African youth." And he closed with this warning: "This is a huge missed opportunity. It could become a recipe for disaster." With the expected population growth, Africa stands at a tipping point, and the next year will be crucial. In my mind, what the 2018 index points to is we must address the structural flaws in our African nations be they societal, institutional, and/or constitutional. And we are running out of time. Institution building must be made stronger than the individual. There is no substitute for this in Africa or anywhere in the world. The transference cannot be imposed, it must be demand-driven. The citizens need to be empowered through civic education, decentralization of governance, and democracy practiced at the community level. In a World Bank Commission of Growth and Development paper, scholars from MIT and Harvard argue that institutions are the fundamental cause of economic growth and development across countries. They note that in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, the promotion of democracy, check and balances, and accountability will almost certainly lead to improved institutions and economic policies. Similarly, I would add that necessary conditions for development also rely on improving the rule of law, assuming democratic transitions, controlling corruption, and assuring property rights. Indeed, for all of these, institutions are indispensable. Weak and non-existing institutions are shared variable of fragile states, including Liberia. This is why Liberia's historic presidential transition in January was meant to be more than a change of administration, a transfer of power to the people, and a move to institutional accountability. Hindering the development of strong institutions in Africa lead to endemic corruption and patron clientelist politics, which are the most formidable barriers to making democracy work. They must be fought with all tools available. There must be no place to hide. I shout out to my sister Ngozi, whose recent book, Fighting Corruption is Dangerous, shows how corruption destroys the fabric of a nation, and systemic effort must be taken to root it out. The only sustainable power of support must come from the people. While the club of legacy leaders grows smaller, the damage that they inflict moves far beyond borders and across continents. Love of country is about letting go. Political parties are organized by patronage and patriarchy. We must take on constitutional reform to achieve malpractice and inequities. Campaign finance law is essential, as in many African nations, unregulated monies pollute a political system to a point where voters will become unrecognizable. Further quotas, to be phased out over time, should be utilized as a tool to address inequities for women, for youth, and considered for the disabled, all of whom have no seat at the table in too many African countries. I applaud the new Prime Minister of Ethiopia for the astounding pace of change, especially ushering in the Year of the Woman in Ethiopia. Appointing women to 50% of his cabinet, a woman to lead the Supreme Court, and the emergence of the first ever woman appointed to the presidency, Sirleaf Swede. Over the last 2 decades, Sub-Saharan Africa has boasted some of the most dramatic breakthroughs in women political representation in national legislative bodies. According to the Brookings Institution, the number of female legislators on the continent grew from 9.5% in 1995 to 23.2% in 2016. In comparison, Europe, excluding the Nordic nations, came in at 24.3%, and America at 27.7%. Yesterday's historic elections was great for the United States. Nearly 100 will be represented in the House out of 435. It is not just the numbers, but the firsts. The youngest woman, 2 Muslim women, 2 lesbian women, a Native American. America has come of age. We can say the same in Rwanda under the leadership of my brother, President Paul Kagame, which boasts the highest percentage of women legislature in the world due to a quota system imposed to address historical inequities. And in the Mo Ibrahim Index, Rwanda has the sharpest rise in broad-based economic reforms. This shows that enlightened leaders and focused leadership can shake up a system. Likewise, we must capture the political energy of the youth. We must open up the political system to young and lower the age of political participation. I'm sure many of you have watched the changes made in Nigeria. As Africa's most populous country, nearly 115 million of its citizens are below the age of 25. Yet political leadership is held tightly by the older generation. Nigeria's youth population successfully mobilized to reduce the age to participate in the highest level of government in the aptly named Not Too Young to Run. In that campaign that succeeded, now candidates for the presidency can run at 35 instead of 40, governorship at 30 instead of 35, and the House of Representatives at 25. These young people who brought change to Nigeria's political system are now themselves running for office in Nigeria's 2019 national elections. Even if their campaigns are unsuccessful, these young people have set the stage. They have disrupted the status quo and inspire others to participate in the political process. Education, my last area of suggestion, is the stabilizer of the society. Look at the American example. A major component of the civil rights struggle focused on the right to quality education, where pioneer and trailblazer Thurgood Marshall achieved victory at the U.S. Supreme Court in the historic ruling of Brown versus the Board of Education. The fight for the future of Africa is now in the classrooms. And here too, the Mo Ibrahim Index sounded an alarm. According to the 2018 index, the education score of more than half of African countries are getting worse, meaning in the 5 years, children are receiving less education and teaching is of a lower standard. We must work harder. When you look at the numbers, it does not come as a surprise. Today, just 10% of official development assistance from OECD countries is allocated to education in Africa, and many African nations have great difficulty meeting the UNICEF goal of 20% of state budget support for education. I know how challenging this can be when there are so many priorities in the country: roads, power, water, sanitation, healthcare, security, job creation. Nevertheless, we must all, as Africans, try hard to do better. As noted by Zimbabwean businessman, philanthropist, and education expert Strive Masayiwa, if African children are educated, prepared for the modern workforce, and equipped with the skills to be successful entrepreneurs, they will flourish, and Africa would prosper. But if our children fail any further behind their peers in developing countries, economic progress will be slowed, stunted, or even thrown into reverse. This is why I applaud the establishment of the International Finance Facility for Education, an initiative from the Education Commission put in place to support Sustainable Development Goal number 4. IFFE is expected to unlock some $10 billion in grants and loans by 2020 to help countries to strengthen their educational systems. Using innovative financing techniques, the IFFE will help donor money to do more, will incentivize government participation, and make impactful difference in Africa's children and young people. But external financing is only part of the problem. The real burden is on African governments to prioritize education and human capital development. Nelson Mandela said, education was key for the success of a post-apartheid South Africa. The power of education extends beyond the development of skills we need for economic success. It can contribute to nation building and to reconciliation. My dear friends, I know I have only touched a fraction of the possibility to discuss with my remarks, but I hope that they provide the underpinning for a spirited discussion that will follow. In closing, I ask you to celebrate those leaders who introduce transformation change in their country, whether it's Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed, with gender parity, the President of Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo, with vision of Ghana beyond aid, or President Paul Kagame, who has enacted policies to promote technology and communication, making Rwanda a technological hub for the continent. We applaud them and celebrate them. And we know that their motivation will help to inspire so many of Africa's other leaders. We are in a race against time in keeping up with our population growth and the rising expectations of our young people. We must meet their impatience with timely and effective action. Thank you.
Sit right over there.
You're going to sit over there?
Okay.
President Sirleaf. We have time for a question and answer session. I don't know that I can think of a better panel of experts to talk with the group tonight, and I would like to allow the first question to go to one of the young Watson scholars, Jackie Williams. Are you there, Jackie? Would you like to address your first question? And we have a microphone. Janice has it right there. We just wait a second for her to get to you. Please tell us your name and bring your question to the group.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. So my name is Jacqueline Williams. I am a Jeanette K. Watson Fellow, class of 2018. And I just want to thank you for your wise words and for organizing this event today. So my question is a two-part question. First, I'd like to know if equal representation of women at the highest level of government and business is enough to eradicate the unfair treatment and injustice women face. And what, aside from representation, are we fighting for in the 21st century in America? And how can we support our sisters around the world whose voices and concerns still remain at the periphery?
That's a lot. So I've got to take time and program it one by one. You have three different segments of this. One had to do with what do we do to motivate, right? I think we need role models all over the world, role models that are willing to set the example, that are willing to take the risk, that are willing to claim leadership. And with that, I have found from my own experience that you find a lot of followers. You find many of those who would like to imitate, who would like to be a part of that. Today, as I go around, young girls, not only in Africa, but all over, see the inspiration of women leadership that are expanding all over the continent. But there was something else you said.
It was about, is it enough? Yes. Jackie, were you saying, is it enough to overcome? Could you ask that last part of your question again?
Yes. So I wanted to know, aside from representation, what else are we fighting for? Aside from fair and equal representation at the highest levels of government and business, and how can we support our sisters around the world?
I believe the high levels of government need to have many more women to be able to provide the inspiration. I believe networking across continents, across areas, where the example of others and the successes of others can become a motivating factor for the others who are trying. And I think one must also want to claim leadership. One must be willing to take the risks to claim leadership. And I believe that those who inspire and motivate, and those who are determined and focused to work for claiming leadership will use this inspiration to propel them along their path of success.
Wonderful.
I'd like to add that the President spoke about the importance of the rule of law. So I hope that as women are elected to a variety of positions, that they actually pass laws to really institutionalize some of these changes, and not just kind of think because they're there that everything will stay. So that rule of law part, I think, is very, very important. And I'm hoping that that will happen in the United States now. And one of the things that you were talking about also, Madam President, was about property rights.
Yeah.
I do think that I was on a commission with Hernando de Soto under UNDP talking about this. The property rights have to make clear that women can inherit land. so that when you look at one thing, you also take up the larger issue that is preventing women from inheriting land, but also to have access to justice. So it's a variety of steps, but it begins with having women elected to office or those in the cabinets of their countries.
Wonderful.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Other questions? Just raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone over right here. Please tell us your name.
Sure, thank you. Ali Mazzara, I'm with the State University of New York, and I run a program to support young women to become global leaders. So we're delighted to be here. One of our recent students is here, and she's now working with me as a colleague. So one of my questions was, what words of encouragement could you say to these potential global leaders? You've said a lot of great things about role models, et cetera. So I rephrase it to say, what words of encouragement can you give when people are finding challenges and fighting challenges before them in their leadership?
I'm going to begin with this because, in fact, I said some of this in my remarks. When the road has potholes, get a canoe. I really do think that one has to look for every possible step because the potholes will be there. And therefore, I think it takes ingenuity and the desire to make it work. How did you paddle?
You learn fast. No, challenges inspire. Challenges build the stamina to succeed. And you will lose. Failure is success upside down. But that determination, that focus, that drive is what moves you. And once you get started, you know, every step only motivates you for another step. And so, but I believe it all comes from the determination inside to want to achieve the goals that you have set and to stay focused on it.
Beautiful. Sarah, if we could have a microphone over there. Thanks, Uzo.
Thanks so much. Sarah Kiambu, with the International Center for Research on Women. Madam President, always so grateful for your emphasis of education as vital to social and economic development, and also thinking of the many challenges that have surfaced just in our Q&A today. I'm thinking to the start of our week and the Bamenda capture, if you will, school being so important to local communities, to youth across Africa, and to youth here in the United States. What should we be doing in terms of policy and services at a federal and state level to keep schools secure and safe for students so that parents will send them to school and they can continue through their education, hopefully to higher education?
I think the rule of law, the policies that enable teachers to be safe, the policies that bring to a community the kinds of safety measures that bring confidence in people. What schools are facing now in this country with terrorism undermines everything that you and others are doing to promote education, because it creates a fear. And when children are afraid to go to school, what do you leave them with? You leave them with just computers and telephones, and then they begin to rely on social media for knowledge. So I think the laws, you all would have to make those laws to protect the citizens, and I think it means strengthening teachers, giving them the means to be able to do it. But Madeleine, you may want to respond to that also.
Well, I think that I have been trying to say the worst part is when our young people think that they have to wear flak jackets to school, where they don't feel secure in the schools. And I think we have a genuine problem because I happen to think that it's not a good idea to give teachers guns, that there needs to be some other way to be able to defend our schools. I think we have to look at some of the lessons, but the saddest part is that we have to, I don't want us to become an armed state. You had a military dictatorship.
Yeah.
I don't want to see it happening here. I've just written a book. It's called Fascism, A Warning. And among that, what one warns about is about a bully with an army. And so you have to be very careful, I think, not to create, to really propagate that kind of an atmosphere. I happen to think that we need to have some, and you won't be surprised that I'm saying this, some way to control guns. It is not possible for us to let everybody have a gun.
Madam President, can you share with us a little bit, it's a sense from the rest of the world that your platform when you were elected president was in the midst of this extreme violence, and precisely the question that Sarah raised, families wanted to send their children to school. So is it not the case that women were a large part and their calls for safety for children and basic ability to go to school were part of what saw you to be elected as president?
Women were the large part of how we succeeded to defeat militarism, how we succeeded to get children back into school. Women during the war were the victims. They had to support most of the needs of the family. Most of the men had gone to war, to conflict. Young boys were conscripted into the army themselves. The women bore the burden, not only of being taken care of what was left, but also when the war ended, they were faced with all these young soldiers returning into the communities, only with a sense of violence. And it was the women who had to start the whole process. It was the women who challenged the military government at the time, challenged what was then the Taylor government, to be able to stop the violence, to be able to appeal to what the ECOWAS, to the Economic Community of West African States, for them to take a strong position of support to bring the war to an end. And so women really were the catalysts in everything that brought peace to our country.
Other questions? I see a couple of hands. Sorry, I can't see you too well. I think there's one right here and one right here. JJ, can you get the thanks?
Hi, Rebecca Barron. I am a Jeanette K. Watson Fellow as well. And Madam President, I wanted to thank you for sharing your story. And I see a lot of strength when fighting for the rights of people and a love for your country. As an aspiring surgeon, it's a field where women are not equally represented. I wanted to ask you, what advice do you have for young women who are going into various fields, and what is your source of strength?
It's changing. You're absolutely right. The stereotype of the past in terms of what profession women pursued or were allowed to pursue has changed. It has to reach the place where we see there's equity, not even in some places equal opportunity. But I believe people like you set the example. You become the role models. And there's so many of you now all over the world that are pursuing their own dreams, that are pursuing just exactly what they want to be, even if society norms did not accord that traditionally. And so I think right now it's an open field for women, and I think women are pursuing every area in their career. And every additional one that breaks through in one way or the other provides great incentive and motivation for the hundreds others that will follow and establish their dreams in whatever area they want and continue to pursue it.
Madeleine, would you like to add to that? Okay. There's a question just over here, please.
Hello, Lola Adedokin from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation here in New York. It's an honor and an inspiration to be here after the drama of yesterday and the last 2 years. My question is related to how do we bring men along? Men of color, particularly here in the United States, are often equally disenfranchised as women. Well-meaning men who mean to do the best for all of us, but then are maybe misguided or misinformed. What guidance do you have on how we bring men along in this fight for equality?
Good question.
Well, I think that is a very important question because I think that the last thing we need are gender wars. And I do think as women, we do want to be respected, and it's very important that we're represented in all the various questions and points that have just been raised. But I think that it is very important to bring the men along and see them as allies. I often say this as I'm sometimes asked whether the world would be better if it was only run by women. And I say, if you believe that, you have forgotten high school. So the important part is to actually have men and women work together. And so I'm all for that.
No, you're so right. We can't do it alone. So the process of sensitizing, conscientizing, continuing, and in some cases, some laws help also. If you look at the Nordic countries, just like you have maternal leave, you have paternal leave. Yeah. Men are in the kitchen cooking now in certain places, and I hope it's taking root here also, as in other places. But I think we got to keep talking about it. And every time there is an exemplary man, and I mentioned 3 of them in Africa, and they've got quite a few here, I'm sure. These exemplary men then spread the word. And after all, it is very clear, women participation strengthens the economy, increases gross domestic product. There's no doubt about it. Empirical evidence is there. You can't leave the participation of women out of the process of development if you want to enjoy full development results. And I believe men are beginning to understand that. And it's beginning to work because they know that with women participation, it's fine. Women, it moves faster. What did Margaret Thatcher say? If you want to talk, bring men. If you want to get work, bring women.
Bring women. Yeah.
All right, beautiful said. Well, if you all would join me in thanking our honoree, President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf.
Thank you. Thank you.
And also to say thank you to the Aspen Institute for letting Madeleine and I squeeze in this important conversation in a busy week. President Sirleaf has just celebrated her 80th birthday. And Secretary Albright, Madeleine, thank you so much for all you do for all of us. Thank you all for joining us.